Hey everyone, welcome to the training session for the Open Grand Final of USUDC 2025. The motion reads, this House believes that the United States should dissolve its non-nuclear offensive military capabilities. First, we'll do a full top half on the motion, and then after that, we will talk about our reasoning for placing this motion in the Open Grand Final, strategic considerations on the motion, and additional arguments that you could run on back half even after the top half that you just watched. Is everyone ready for me to start? Okay, great. There are no winners in war. Since 2001, over 350,000 innocent civilians have died because of the US's offensive military operations, and it's time for this figure to stop growing. Over the next several years, Congress, the Department of Defense, and other military advisors are probably going to roll out a plan for dissolving the US's offensive capabilities. This plan likely has the following components. One, we're going to decommission old fighter jets, tanks, and other military equipment, and we'll stop training soldiers in offensive combat techniques. Two, we'll use some of this freed up money to help workers in the defense industry transition elsewhere, and we'll further invest in healthcare and infrastructure to soften any possible economic blow from the decrease in size of the Defense Department. Third, we'll give another part of this money to DARPA for investing in more defensive cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, intelligence gathering, and other missile systems. We'll also train soldiers more robustly in defensive tactics, and we'll leave some money aside for humanitarian aid. Conveniently, this means CG cannot run any argument about reducing spending since we're just reallocating this massive amount of money elsewhere. Fourth, we will renegotiate any strategic commitments that require US military capabilities to be offensive. So, for example, we're going to stay in NATO, but instead pledge to allies within NATO that will just provide allies defensive technology if Article 5 somehow becomes activated. Similarly, we're going to give allies like Japan and South Korea more defensive equipment instead of offensive equipment. If there aren't any questions, three arguments. Firstly, why offensive operations are
Clarification.
sure.
Sorry, what do you mean by defensive equipment and technology? Like, what do they look?
So, for example, missile defense systems like the Iron Dome that Israel has. Firstly, why is this immoral? The strongest possible set of opposition arguments are about deterrence and humanitarian interventions. Giving those arguments full credit, we think conducting offensive operations is immoral. In other words, it is far worse to kill someone than it is to allow someone to die. And there are two reasons why this is true. Firstly, causing death just to save other lives involves using people as a means to an end. This is morally wrong since individuals have inherent moral worth about them. Whenever I take an action, like picking up a cookie, I will that action to be valuable. Someone else might think that it's useless. This means that my agency determines what is valuable, and without it, we cannot decide what happiness or suffering matters. As such, it is morally wrong to cause someone to die independent of consequences. Secondly, the only coherent way to derive objective morality is from our basic intuitions. While we believe in some basic moral truths, most other systems of moral realism collapse because they rely on us taking initial intuitions to be true. Following from that, it's clearly worse to cause someone to die than to not save a life. We would not publicly kill an innocent person to deter crime. We would not kill one patient, harvest their organs, and use their organs to save five other lives. Meanwhile, most people do not think they have obligations to donate all of their earnings to charity, and most people do not give up all of their time trying to save the lives of others. Argument two, why do the US's interests when conducting offensive operations trend in a bad direction? So, of course, there are some examples where US offensive involvement in other states may be considered good, like in Yugoslavia, for example, others where it was clearly bad, like in Iraq. Why do those incentives trend in a bad way? And by a bad way, what I mean is conducting invasions for resources at the expense of many innocent civilians. There are two broad mechanisms under this argument. One, defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and Palantir engage in intense lobbying for the US to engage in offensive operations. Why is that lobbying effective relative to competing interests like those of voters? The biggest reason is that these contractors have enormous amounts of money and compete for contracts. The work they do tends to be uniquely lucrative because of how much it costs to create things like military equipment, giving them significant amounts of spare money to lobby. And with this influx of money, politicians can do much more campaigning on other issues like the economy that those same voters still deeply care about. And on top of that, there's a revolving door. Many people who work in the Department of Defense, for example, have also worked for these defense companies. And further, defense contractors benefit from these operations. It gives them new data on how different military technology works. See up the role of F-1 fighter jets in Operation Just Cause. So this establishes why the military industrial complex lobbies for offensive operations even when unnecessary. Secondly, politicians have selfish incentives to go to war. For instance, a major reason that the US invaded Iraq was to secure oil reserves, helping US energy markets. This helps politicians because then people attribute lower prices to those politicians and vote them back in. It helps their parties as well. I know what they're going to say. The public can hold these politicians accountable, but there are two reasons this is insufficient. One, in cases where the public opposes the war, it's often difficult to hold politicians accountable. For example, politicians can keep information about war efforts confidential for national security reasons or under the guise that it's for counterterrorism efforts. But secondly, in other cases, the public will only oppose specific interventions once you meet a sufficiently high threshold of the body bag effect kicking in and a sufficiently large number of voters getting angry. But that means the damage is already done. Buildings are already blown up. You have already intervened, at which point, even if they do hold politicians accountable, it is reactive rather than proactive. What all this establishes is that on average, the US uses its military might in evil ways. Fewer civilians die on our side of the house. They might say, oh no, guys, now the US will just nuke other countries because maybe it has the same bad incentives. But obviously, the incentives I just mentioned don't apply. There's less of a political gain from nuking another country versus taking control of oil fields, and the lobbying identified doesn't happen for the use of nuclear technologies. And even if bad incentives exist on both sides, we are literally just handicapping the US government's ability to engage in these negative operations, since now it can only provide countries with defensive weaponry. Final argument, we weaken global terrorism. Two ways. One, we weaken the strength of terrorist propaganda. Many groups, such as Al Qaeda and ISIS, use US offensive military presences in other countries as a way to strengthen their recruitment efforts. So, for example, Al Qaeda was significantly angry at the US's presence in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War in 1990. And sure, these terrorist groups have other justifications, but this is an especially powerful one. US involvement has ravaged countries in the Middle East. So in many cases, it is the tipping point when you individually can think of a loved one or get scared for your loved one being hurt by the US and therefore at the margin want to take up arms with this particular group. But secondly, strategies that the US uses to take out terrorists actually just make terrorism worse. In particular, the US is responsible for many different decapitation strikes, such as launching drone strikes at specific terrorist leaders. But this is bad. One, because even when it's successful, it makes terrorism worse. Why? Because remember that it's not very resource intensive to build a bomb. It just means that the groups are smaller and more splintered. But now they're motivated by emotional anger rather than political aims because they think there's no possibility of negotiating. So they're more likely to do things like go for soft targets such as schools rather than harder targets like military bases. But secondly, sometimes it doesn't succeed. Leaders move from safe house to safe house and are very, very difficult to track, meaning tons of innocent people die in the interim, and now more people join these groups, making terrorism worse.
Fun stuff. Okay. I'll start in three, two, one, go. We're happy to counterprop, reducing in some limited instances some of the capabilities. Probably reducing the amount of drones and the drone strikes it indulges in is probably a generally good thing, and we're happy to have that also be part of what we ourselves do. This already starts to take out some of the Gov argumentation at the bottom of that PM anyways. There are two notes I want to make of the principle. One, it is not clear why us as arbiters should care about the US getting its own moral hands dirty if more people on the ground are able to get far more of a life, are able to have a life in the first place, give or help their children, help their own spouses, in many instances put food on the table anyways, right? And secondly, even if we don't have an obligation to save someone morally, surely the fact that we are helping them is itself good, and we would prefer to live in a world where that help is still existing. So maybe the US doesn't have a full obligation to do this, but we would still prefer living in a world where the US still did provide a lot of that help anyways. Secondly, I do think the US does actually have an obligation. They've often made direct contracts in many instances promising refusing to provide a lot of that offensive military support and provide the tanks and machinery to try and help the nations develop themselves, I do not understand why they have the moral obligation to withdraw that in the first place. And secondly, they've often been directly responsible for harm in the past, either by like overthrowing or toppling governments that are responsible for the problems that are there today, or worsening the terrorists in the first place. They have an obligation to at least provide some military support to people on the ground and protect them from the harms that they have created. The first thing to note is that at least the US is a far better counterbalancing act against much worse actors in China or Russia. Let's look at Gov's incentives. They talk about contractors. The problem is that Lockheed Martin doesn't go away on the comparative. It often is far likely to sell directly to a lot more of those worst competitors like China or Russia, or via subsidiaries to their other allies who are like China or Russia light allies. And as we'll argue, they're often a lot worse. Their argument on public being holding the politicians accountable misses a burden, which is it doesn't explain why politicians today or tomorrow have a strong incentive to actively worsen war or increase in war in many instances. And I argue the reason they often do not is precisely because of past instances of fears of backlash from past wars. Currently, right now, you already see so much trauma and anger people have, not just over Vietnam, but over Iraq and Afghanistan, which has made prior politicians literally pull troops back anyways. And in many instances, politicians have become more populist and looking locally, trying to put more money towards people on the ground within the nation, which means already they don't want to indulge in the worst forms of like active wars that Gov themselves want to talk about. Why are the US incentives better than China, even if Gov is true? Or China or Russia or North Korea, whichever one you want to talk about. First, a lot of these other nations often have like yes men and strong cultures that are protecting the top dictators at the top. That literally means things that they have far less access to accurate information in many instances compared to the democratic US government that often puts this information up above. It often means there's far less checks and balances. If Putin has like a terrible like mentality and has like an irrational need to try and spread his spread his government, or what China does when China indulges in the North China Sea expansions, the US has far better check back mechanisms from other branches of government like Congress or like the judiciary in many instances. So this means nations like China and Russia are far more exploitative in terms of actually trying to indulge in resource exploitation, but also in terms of things that literally expand exports, right? Like China literally tries and does things like invade into other nations to try and increase its control over the South China Sea. Everyone knows about Russia and Ukraine in many instances. So even if the US isn't great, it at least provides far better regional stability within the region. Like it literally reduces the amount of cartel and cartel support towards South America by providing some offensive capabilities towards Mexico to protect itself against those nations. And also it's a very good check back mechanism, right? So for example, in the South China Sea, it has its own 13 war carriers right up close against China's ones that in many instances reduces the incentive for China to try and indulge in either active invasion or at least take control of larger percentages of that South China Sea.
On this,
look at the arguments on this. No, first of all, we are often able to provide a lot of help to NATO that otherwise couldn't exist. I think Gov actively destroys NATO and a huge number of other defense packs that relies quite a lot on offensive US capabilities, right? Like warships, like tanks, like missiles in many instances, right? And a lot of those countries now often have a greater incentive to either actively leave the NATO because the hugest amount of money that the United States, the most powerful nation in the world, is not going to be able to provide anyways. And now they themselves have to spend a huge amount of more money on their defense. This is two problems. One, it actively increases the incentive for Russia to become far more aggressionary in future. So actively like indulge in far more horrific strikes or acts both within Ukraine or within other nations because Putin has explicitly said he wants to expand his own territory of Russia anyways. But secondly, it often has destroyed the capacity of these other local nations. Previously, they often were really good welfare nations that spent most of their money on helping their own people develop. Now they have to spend far larger percentages of their money on defense, which trades off against helping their own local population. That also in some instances worsens populism, and often a lot of the new defense structures they have are far worse, right? Like they are new, they often do not have the same supply chains, they have far less expertise in many instances. So this often means that both stopping Russian invasion, but also stopping things like active like squabbles between local nations that sometimes lead to border skirmishes happens a lot worse because you don't have US military weaponry that helps them. Secondly, it obviously means, as I've explained before, in instances such as China expanding into the South China Sea, taking mineral resources from many many other nations that previously were within their own naval boundaries. In some instances, actively worsening border skirmishes between North Korea and South Korea because the US doesn't provide sufficient military weaponry that's offensive in nature to try and make North Korea fear that the US and many North Korea fear that you're going to come back and attack them. And obviously, nukes are pretty insufficient here because the point is, since nukes are seen as like a dead zone, right? Like if I indulge in a nuke, they will indulge in me. That's game over. Often, the only way to have the meaningful threat is via these smaller level conventional offensive military warfare. Thirdly, I think it often actively makes terrorism worse, right? Look, even if you don't have terrorist propaganda against the United States, organizations like the Taliban and in many instances like Al Qaeda or ISIS are going to exist. They will still kill people, and they do still have a wide variety of narratives on the ground that are quite effective as well. This means your only capacity to reduce them is by trying to do things like conduct the occasional decapitation strike, send a Navy SEAL after those leaders, literally fund like UN peacekeeping troops on the ground to try and help them anyways. Thirdly, this also in many instances helps with humanitarian aid. So often the US is able to send soldiers with active offensive weaponry and tactics on how to be offensive to protect NGOs on the ground that are working within like war-torn areas, or in some instances within areas that could be war-torn in some regions of Africa, right? So you're often actively incentivizing a lot of the proper humanitarian aid that's often going to really help them. That's you're not going to be able to do if you don't have that offensive military anyways. Finally, I just think this also leads to a lot of US people being seriously employed, like unemployed, like a lot of nations, like a lot of states depend on that military. And that means a lot of people are going to be unemployed that can, in some instances, worsen populism within the long term as well. There are so many things as to why this is not a good thing to do.
All right, great. Can everyone hear me? Opening opposition gives everyone a knife and is surprised when they hurt each other. On opening government, we do something simpler. We prefer giving everyone a shield. So even if there is someone with a knife, at least everyone can stop them and the same outcome happens. Three things in this debate. First, on safety, regional security, whatever it was that Op said and why we think it actually gets far better when defensive weaponry is the norm. Secondly, on the principle. And finally, on bad political incentives and why you worsen aggression against the US and against other countries. On safety, the top level claim made by opposition, which is echoed through their impacts on jobs, is things like, oh, Lockheed Martin now just sells to other countries instead. Oh, the defense like contracting agency like suddenly dies in the US and tons of people lose their jobs. Listen to Matt's model. We don't take money away from these people. We just change what they build and we change what they focus their money on. So obviously, all these same incentives and all these same US federal funding that flows into these places still exists. I don't think Lockheed can just sell to different countries because they're a US company. They hold US patents. So if they're developing a rocket launcher or a missile system, the US shuts them down because we're dissolving our US capabilities. So Lockheed has two options. Either they switch to defensive weaponry, and we've explained to you why that incentive is obviously very strong because it's still a profit incentive and they're still getting money for it, or they leave the US, lose all of that funding, lose all of that support. I don't think anyone's actually willing to do that in the first place. So I don't think that these military contractors sell to other people. I think that things just switch to defense like we said they did. We have the fiat to model it so. On the claim of regional stability then, I think defensive weapons are just as, if not more effective for a couple of reasons. First, Matt explains why offensive capabilities, even when they're like well-minded or well-institutionalized, oftentimes lead to escalation and anger because people on the ground don't like US soldiers with guns marching through their streets. There's a much more high like chance of this miscalculation happening, or US generals thinking that they know what is best and then hurting people in those areas, destroying those areas' resources because of bad political incentives when you intervene. But defensive capabilities create the same kind of stability by stopping the need for the problem to exist in the first place. Because now, when someone wants to attack you, you can stop their offensive with better defensive technology. And obviously, the counterfactual is we give them those defensive technologies instead of offensive ones. So I'm not sure why there's a huge delta on regional stability. If anything, escalation makes this worse. On NATO and why you dissolve them, I think there's a pretty big characterization I want to make. NATO isn't trying to take anyone over, right? Like it's not the force of NATO to like beat Russia and take Russia's land from them. So I'm not sure why offensive capabilities are the tipping point that this happens. What NATO is a defense organization. You need the capacity to stop other countries from attacking you or encroaching on your borders. Obviously, defensive technology allows you to do this just as well, if not better, than offensive technology. Four reasons then why we prefer defensive weaponry being disseminated and why we prefer the US to be the ones doing this. First, you
Wait,
can
what?
still export to your allies, as Matt explains. In fact, it's actually far better because in most of these cases, you aren't in active conflict. So in the South China Sea or on the borders of Russia, for example, there's an active war that's happening right now between both forces. And what that means is that defensive weaponry is actually far better to have in these places because it changes the risk calculus that the countries have to make when they attack you. Because now it's just much higher cost for Russia to fight against a country with way better missile deterrence systems, for example. It's far higher cost for China, for example, to attack countries in the South China Sea when they can stop all of their advances with much better defensive technology. And this changes the calculus these countries has. It's a much better form of deterrence because now you're not mutually guaranteeing that both countries will die. You're actually saying that you can stop their advance in the first place with defensive technology. The second thing to note there is that when you have more money and to focus on the defense sector, we get far better outcomes in the first place. And I want to note this is because the US already has a huge technological advantage in terms of weapon systems that very easily translates to defensive technology. So it's not like you're starting again from scratch. You can repurpose a lot of the technology, all of the AI tools you have, for example, drones, for example. You can just repurpose them to be defensive instead of offensive, therefore retaining a lot of your advantage. First, you have a way better ability to stop assaults than on our side of the house, and you save much more lives because you create a wider range of technology. All the stuff Matt told you about cyber technology, why you're able to better your missile interception systems, mean that you can protect against a wider variety of threats, and you can stop countries that are much more innovative with their attacks, which means you have much better capabilities overall. But secondly, advances in defensive technology have more returns because you can specialize to stop effective weapons from enemies. You can do things like make them much more effective against certain types of assaults and specialize them to certain situations, whereas a missile is just a missile. But third, you get way more talent and support into the field when you don't face the constant political opposition from groups who say things like, oh, we don't want you to make more bombs and do things like that. But also, I think a lot more engineers in the US, for example, are willing to opt into the military-industrial complex when they don't believe they're just building a bomb that's going to kill someone, but rather building a defense system that saves people's lives. So I think that we get far better tech on our side of the house and use it in far better ways because we dissolve that opposition and make the US do what it should have been doing the whole time. But finally, I think that geopolitically, this is far better for the US in that it avoids escalation. On their side of the house, when you build up offense, what you cause is the escalation of other countries in the area also building up their own offensive materials as well. Four reasons for this. One, other countries must match the US attacks to reassure their constituents. There's tons of democratic pressure from countries where US is present to build up their own militaries in case the US turns on them one day. But secondly, newer types of weapons and scales of damage force other countries to follow suit, or else they face a huge disadvantage when it comes to warfare. So when the US develops a new kind of supersonic missile, for example, other countries have to spend huge amounts of money developing those things as well to reassure their constituents and their militaries, money that they probably should have been spending somewhere else that was far better. But third, an offensive US disseminates weapons rapidly, which oftentimes inflates regional tensions and proxy wars in the hands of other actors. So when you give away missile systems and they get lost and you pull out of countries, for example, that's actually far worse for the kinds of escalation you create. But finally, I think perceptually, when there are US soldiers marching through the streets with guns, this just upsets a ton of people. This is the tipping point to many more countries being unwilling to capitulate, unwilling to give up their own militaries, much more militant in the first place because they fear the threat that the US poses. Before I go any further, I'll take the point.
So, considering that missiles is something that you can't do as much of because the motion doesn't allow you to, how expensive is
Yes.
it to set up an Iron Dome? How long does it take considering they never
I
done it
promise
before?
you, it is not any more expensive than to make the same capitulating amount of weapons that you would create on your side of the house, especially because of all the arguments that explains as to why military contractors are able to inflate those expenses on either side of the house. So obviously, we just repurpose this technology. The Iron Dome is just a ton of smaller missiles that can stop things and a bunch of other safety measures. Obviously, we can do this, right? On the principle, really quickly, I think Pranav just fully fails to respond to it. Pranav responds, there's an obligation to help people. Matt's principle is not whether we should help people or not. It is that it is morally wrong to kill someone to help someone else, especially when you have the monopoly of violence, especially when you are indiscriminate in the ways the US is indiscriminate. So even if opposition wins deterrence, it does nothing for them because it is morally unsanctionable to deter in a way that kills more people. We prove better deterrence because we raise the price of attacking a country and allow them to stop weapons with much more certainty. But finally, on bad political incentives, I think it's a simple argument. When there is a button, people push it. And when people profit from the button being pushed, there are reasons to push it much more often. The pushback from opposition is, politicians have incentives not to make wars happen because bad wars have happened in the past. Three levels of pushback. One, completely unresponsive to Matt's argument as to why resource payoffs and political benefits are far more proximate to voters and allow you to get them in much more easily. But secondly, obviously, they still have, contractors still have, political interest to use the media and advocacy to pump up interest in these wars, to obfuscate things that are happening and to make them politically viable for people on the ground. I think a lot of their arguments are unresponsive to the simple claims we make. The impact of this argument is winning us this round because it proves even if one intervention is good, we get 10 interventions on opposite the house, and nine of them are bad, nine of them are principally unviable, nine of them kill far more people than they save, and for those reasons, we're proud to propose.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. OG wants to say that US is Big Daddy and US has been putting its tentacles in nations all across the world. Their solution is to say that Big Daddy should completely disappear, right? And this is obviously incredibly ludicrous because what they're necessarily defending is the complete dissolution of the kinds of dependencies that already exist in the status quo. And so the argument isn't whether or not more or less marginal offensive weapons would be good. It's whether or not the countries that already have US troops, that already rely on US supply chains, if these weapons were to disappear, would these countries be able to survive? And the basic argument is that nations are self-interested, right? We live in a state of war. And so when it is the case that other actors see that you no longer have the ability to retaliate against the actions they take, then obviously the Global Balancing Act completely disintegrates, right? Like, obviously, you have an incentive to violate sovereign borders and to take over other countries' territories and to escalate conflicts to the extent that these countries are now unable to respond for the exact reason that OG gave to you. So in this speech, I'll do three things. First, respond to this defensive argument, wishy-washy stuff. Second, I'll explain why regional balancing is very good and very moral. And thirdly, I'll respond to terrorism. First, then, on defensive weapons, there's several responses I'll make that just systematically dismantle the notion that defensive weapons will ever be a sufficient stand-in to deterrence. Number one, defense is always porous. There is literally no defensive capability that you can fiat or imagine that would be able to defend against every single offensive capability. Because if that were the case, it would be unclear as to why these wealthy countries wouldn't have done that in the first place. Moreover, given that you're always uncertain about other nations' incentives, you do not know if their pace of innovation, i.e. being able to develop their offensive capabilities, are now able to circumvent your own defensive capabilities. Very obvious response. Number two, the best defense is obviously a good offense, because the reason why countries choose to not enter war aren't that there is a wall or there's a nuclear dome, because we're not talking about using nukes, right? We're talking about doing things like militarily invading another country by sending drones over their border. So when you increase the cost of war because you increase your ability to retaliate against these attacks, that's the reason why countries don't go in. It's not the fact that they have to just blow up one wall, right? Or they have to blow up a few, I don't even know, they don't provide examples, a few people who are stationed at the border. Number three is that you cannot distinguish between offensive and defensive capabilities in many instances precisely because of what Matt says, which is that you do not know what other countries are doing. So even if it were the case that the US committed explicitly to scaling down their offensive capabilities, if you saw that the military industrial complex still existed, or you saw that factories still existed, obviously other countries have an incentive to escalate, given that they never know what exactly you're developing. They never know if you have a new chemical weapon. They never know if you have a new atomic bomb. So their burden was to prove that perfect information was possible, which it just clearly isn't. And fourthly, it's just that defensive capabilities are a lot more expensive because your hands are tied behind your back, because you cannot do things that are offensive, right? You have to have a perfect impenetrable structure, however that looks. And that's obviously a lot more expensive because you have to have perfect compliance, whereas offensive capabilities does not require perfection. That's the reason why it's insufficient. Moreover, then, the second thing we want to prove is why this is just pretty good for regional balancing, because the precise argument that Rahul gives you that you have an incentive to escalate is why we think that having offensive capabilities actually does lead to peace. And this might sound relatively unintuitive, but the logic behind this argument is just that if other countries see you developing offensive capabilities and they match that ability to develop, then neither side has an incentive to go to war precisely because there's mutually assured destruction. And their response might be oh, why are nukes enough? But this ignores Pranav's argument, which Rahul doesn't respond to, which is that if you know that I nuke you and you nuke me and we both explode into smithereens, then obviously you know that the US isn't going to use nukes, even for instances where, for instance, Russia invades Ukraine, which is the reason why conventional warfare has actually increased after the advent of nuclear weapons development. But when you are able to ensure that you can have a proportional response to any kind of escalation that a country has, that's the reason why very oftentimes they do not have an incentive to go for war. Matt's argument is oh, the military industrial complex exists, which makes you go to conflict more often than you should. But the response here is that, like, just because the US military industrial complex might have their hands tied doesn't mean that the military industrial complex of every other nation doesn't exist symmetrically and also applies equal pressure for those countries to have an incentive to go to war. So in their worst case, those military industrial complex still fan the flames of conflict, but the only issue is that there's no counterbalancing force that exists. And they might say the US doesn't have perfect incentives, but we're talking about a comparative debate. That is what we already told you, is that number one, US tends to respect sovereign borders more than other nations. Number two, because the US has democratic institutions, they can at least be held relatively more accountable compared to states where there's a top-down approach to imposing your willpower. And number three, even if the US was equally as bad as Russia and China, our argument is that their ability to balance against these countries is precisely the reason why these countries cannot just impose their will however they want to. It's the reason why Russia hasn't invaded more borders of other nations and violated their own territorial sovereignty, right? Like, I think this is just quite intuitive, where if you take away one of the major global superpowers and you take away the ability of their allies and their security umbrella to be able to ever achieve the same level of protection that they had before, then obviously these actors have a personal incentive to violate their sovereignty. The third thing that I want to talk about is just this morality and terrorism argument. And I just do not think there's an action-inaction distinction, because history already exists. That is, if I already exist in a country and I take my troops away from that country, clearly that is an action that does not absolve me of my immoral actions in the first place. Just because the US took away their troops from Afghanistan and did nothing doesn't mean that they're not held morally responsible for leaving Afghanistan in a power vacuum, right? For leaving the civilians on the ground to be slaughtered. I just do not think that a distinction exists at the point where you have already acted in the first place. Number two, you already have these nations incredibly dependent on you. And number three, I think a failure to intervene in instances where violence is likely to escalate, i.e. genocides, i.e. humanitarian crisis, is quite bad. And you are obviously morally responsible for that, because you're a bystander that is watching these things happen, and because you are uniquely able to solve these things in ways other countries aren't, because they're not regional hegemons. Pretty obvious. And that's the reason why terrorism is likely to escalate as well. Because to the extent to which you are now seen as leaving these places high and dry, obviously terrorism groups can co-opt this. And obviously they have an incentive to just be opportunistic and take advantage of these power vacuums. Very proud.
All right, hi everyone. We'll move into the training portion of this session. Unfortunately, Helen and Rahul had to leave, but we'll talk through placement first. So the CA team felt that this motion was the deepest motion in our set, where we literally found 10, sometimes more than 10 paths to victory for either side. And this is a very big debate in military circles. So we thought that it would be great for determining the winner, both because of its balance and depth. And on top of that, this is a big change topic, so we thought that the audience would find it entertaining, especially given many current events and current conflicts that are ongoing and how this motion might impact those events. This is also something that would be pretty important to talk about in a final that many people would be watching. Pranav, do you want to talk a bit about strategy on this motion?
Yeah, sure. So I think, as hopefully the top half illustrated some, there are a couple of big characterization ideas or deadlocks in some sense to break. So one of the big ones that I think, and the info slide is, I think, for example, the info slide doesn't deliberately tell you what defensive weaponry itself looks like. And I think that's in part because there is an inherent burden for all teams to sort of try and figure out what is the difference between offensive and defensive weaponry, how effectively can it be utilized or made. That was definitely a big part of this top half as well, but that's a pretty good thing, because a pretty important note to make. The second thing, I think it ended up not becoming as important maybe to this round as some others might, but it still became pretty important, which is weighing maybe the relative incentives of the US versus other actors like China, Russia, and maybe a bigger portion of that could be sort of in the absence of this US action, what might reactions from other nations look like? Well, I think the escalation stuff, we still spoke a lot about it, but I think that's another big characterization clash to figure out. And the third thing, I think, is weighing different scenarios. So obviously the US weaponry or offensive weaponry is used in a large variety of conflicts. A lot of them are big international deterrence exchanges, whether we're talking about South China Sea or NATO or that sort of stuff, or like even more regional conflicts for stability, like cartels, or like some forms of humanitarian aid. And then also there are on top of that further domestic implications with regards to, how the military industrial complex itself looks like. So almost all of these require like some picking and weighing, because especially probably after this top half that you see, like it's easy for us to like try and go for a lot of scenarios in like very superficial levels. And so picking a scenario, explaining it pretty well, and figuring out what is the metric on which it's weighed is like pretty helpful.
Great. So I can start by talking about possible CG lines on this motion. There are 5 ideas that I have within the debate, and then there are 2 extra ideas that I can discuss. So for the possible CGs that you can run, given the debate that happened, the first I would say is on moral hazard. The key point here is that many US allies are very reliant on US offensive weaponry, and one could make the argument that this is bad. So, for example, Taiwan may have an implicit assurance that the US will come to its defense if it were ever invaded by China, especially because of the presence of TMSC. So that reduces Taiwan's incentive to invest in its own offensive military capabilities, even though it's very economically well off. And if the US dissolved its offensive military capabilities, it may have more of an incentive to build up its own military capabilities, which one could argue is good because then you can more quickly react to any attack by China. Or it might even incentivize Taiwan to negotiate more with China, for example, which one could argue could be good as well. The second set of possible CG arguments is about provoking other actors. The first argument beneath this is about miscalculation. The key point here is just that the presence of US offensive military weaponry raises significant concern that other actors, such as China or North Korea, may perceive certain US warships, for example, as threats, or certain military exercises as threats, even when they are not. They may not have full intelligence about what that warship is doing in the South China Sea, for example, which may cause these actors to instinctually respond when they wouldn't otherwise. So, for example, see how North Korea has felt provoked by military exercises that the US has done with South Korea in the past, and how, absent offensive military operations, these actors are less likely to perceive that threat to the same extent. There's also a related realist argument that US offensive operations have provoked actors like Russia. So, the argument about why Russia invaded Ukraine in the first place. This would take a lot of proof, but the argument basically goes like this. Actors such as Russia perceive a threat because of US spheres of influence. So, for example, in many cases, Russia views NATO as a US controlled organization and as part of the US's sphere of influence. And leaders like Putin justify military interventions on the basis of being concerned about US spheres of influence and about being concerned that countries such as Ukraine may join NATO and become part of that sphere of influence. But when you abolish your offensive capabilities, that perception goes away. People begin viewing US military influence as waning and as weak, that NATO is more of a weak vessel now. So such actors may not perceive as much of a threat, and therefore at the margin may not want to attack other countries because now the cost of doing so, like economic costs for Russia, become larger than the benefits of, reducing the US sphere of influence. The third possible CG line on this motion is about humanitarian aid. So one thing I did in the model and one thing that gov teams should talk about is how maybe more of this money goes to humanitarian aid to specific countries rather than providing them with military aid. And you can give arguments about why this humanitarian aid specifically is better without offensive weapons. Number one, there's just a scalar increase of it. So if both sides agree it's good, it's just better to have more of it. And that maybe also at the margin could do things like reduce individuals' propensity to join other insurgent groups or terrorist groups. Another argument you can make is that individuals are more likely to accept the humanitarian aid when it doesn't come with troops marching through villages, which feels relatively threatening. People are skeptical of the US. They're less likely to be skeptical of an impartial NGO. And also, there are related arguments about how, for example, the aid workers who are delivering this aid are less likely to be targeted. See, for example, how aid workers in Syria have been targeted due to associations with the United States. Fourth, there are reasonable arguments about current events. one could make the argument that Trump is a pretty unpredictable and volatile actor, and that we should dissolve offensive capabilities so that he cannot use US offensive military weapons in harmful ways against other countries, amplifying many of the other arguments in the round. A plausible form of op pushback against this argument says if Trump is so volatile, maybe he'll just be more inclined to use nukes. I think there's reasonable preemption that CG could do against this argument by just pointing out that the threshold to use nukes, even for a reasonably irrational actor, is much, much higher than the threshold of doing something like, conducting drone strikes in another country or invading another country in a particularly reckless way. And you can also explain why this brand of politics is likely to continue into the future. So even if this model is phased in, maybe other politicians within the RNC are also likely to be similarly volatile because of their populist appeal, for example. Fifth, there is vertical depth about defensive weaponry and why it might be preferable. So, as a gov team should rightly model, you probably invest more in defensive weaponry, more in things like intelligence gathering. And a CG team could give a series of additional ways why this would be beneficial. One way that that might look like is, in many cases, drones to be precise or not drones per se because those are offensive, but other countries may be using drones. So one thing that the US could do is bulk up on its information gathering and intelligence gathering, give that intelligence to its other allies, and those other allies can use that data to like improve the quality of their drones and to defend themselves to a greater extent. It could develop stronger artificial intelligence systems to combat China, since many military experts are concerned that, artificial intelligence will be a deciding factor if the US and China go to war with one another. There are two other ideas that are maybe less relevant to this specific round, but that are important to think about. One is vertical depth on terrorism, cartel activity, other insurgent groups. So at the end of my PM, I gave 2 to 3 brief reasons about why US offensive military operations worsen terrorism, but there are many more reasons that one could run about why things like decapitation strikes are done particularly poorly. So, for example, like significant demonization of specific leaders and why the population might actually push for more reckless drone strikes. More reasons about why groups being splintered is actually bad, and it makes these groups far worse. Finally, uh, it's not clear that this is super winning, but one argument to at least think about in the debate is that, the US spends an enormous amount of money on its military operations and especially its offensive military operations. So if the US were to substantially reduce this spending, that could be good for the US economy. You would significantly reduce deficits, and you can also point to global benefits it could have for other countries, given how interconnected the US is with other economies. Although I think that this path to victory would require a lot of washing out of other impacts and would be pretty risky. So those are my thoughts on CG. Pranav, do you want to talk about CO?
Yeah. So I think similarly in CO, there are probably like 6 or 7-ish ideas. So the first I think is, as I hinted before, there can probably be far more mechanisms on what defensive weaponry is likely to look like in terms of what you would fund and why it might be less of effective than offensive weaponry. So like, just say the research gap or like the amount of time it would take to try and become, say, or get far better at developing a set of weapons, say like an Iron Dome that you've often never done before, or why it's often a lot harder to sell these to a larger variety of nations as compared to, offensive weaponry in many instances. There is then probably a second extension on like which situation tends to involve the most offensive weaponry. So one can, for example, make the claim that often the offensive weaponry is best in areas where asymmetric warfare is most effective, i.e., like I am already a much, much more powerful like actor compared to the others. So say against like local cartels or terrorists, whereas like in instances of say like putting a ships on the South China Sea, it's not as necessary for you to need offensive weaponry, especially if you like don't know whether they have offensive weaponry or not. So a lot of weighing, I think, around which situation you want to pick, and a lot of vertical depth in explaining why that situation uniquely requires offensive weaponry. There is, I think, a third extension on like what the reaction from other countries is going to look like, and I think this can be pretty strategic given that it's not entirely reliant even on whether alternatives such as defensive weaponry and that sort of stuff actually would be effective. It can just be based on like a betrayal that other countries perceive just because you're like breaking some version of their treaties, doing things that you otherwise have not done. And you're often doing it in a very significant way, right? So it's not the same thing as like holding like funding or aid in many instances, because militaries are often seen as like very essential for a nation to like hold other threats to stop other threats from coming to place, something like that. And the problem then is that when these other nations perceive this like US act in this way or breaking pacts in this way in many instances, that can lead to many things. So like, a reduction or an unwillingness to indulge in large trade blocks with you, because they just don't trust you as much as they used to, a willingness to move towards other nations that are far less scrupulous or have far less like democratic checkbacks on like trade relations, like, I don't know, China or like Russia or something like that. Or just like they won't like coordinate with you on many things that require coordination. So like climate change policies, where like at least with democratic administrations, you often have a tendency or a willingness to do something like that. Um, the fourth extension, I think, is just that this blunts the US's ability to conduct good humanitarian interventions. And this is something that they have done in the past, even though we see a lot of the negative ones a lot more. So, when we talk, say, like invasions within Panama or like other offensive operations, you could just argue that they often need offensive operations to say, like, create a safe zone, to like quickly dismantle autocrats, and that they are likely to do this in a good way in the future. There's a fifth extension involving like instances where the threat of force is essential, not just force itself. So like negotiations with like unscrupulous actors like Russia or China on other issues related to trade, and why the threat of force is a lot less compelling when it can only be defensive in nature, and probably like some analysis on how that changes the incentives of China or Russia or whichever other actor you're dealing with or indulging in negotiations with, when they realize the US cannot actually back up much of its like positive threats of force, but only like negative threats of self-defense instead. The I guess like sixth-ish extension is sort of like how this slows the development of a lot of like military innovations, such as like legally like lethally autonomous weapons and that sort of stuff, and arguing that this is often bad because a lot of alternative innovation can focus on a lot of the things like weapons of mass destruction or like nukes, or something that's like far worse, and how that can either like put a lot more of the world on edge or increase the risk of border skirmishes in some instances, just because like you are seen as now willing to stockpile on far more possibly dangerous methods. And especially if you are dealing with Trump, who's not always like a somewhat volatile actor, that often really like puts the hairs of everyone in the world on edge. Finally, there perhaps, but I do think this is a tougher extension to that. You can spend a lot more time on local economies and how they are deeply disrupted within the United States. Many states often have the military as the largest employer and have like subsidiary like contractors as like contributing an even larger percentage of their economy, and how in the absence of that, people can either get like deeply angry or distrustful, and either can like actively vote such a measure of policy back like 10-20 years down the line, although I think that's a bit of a reach, or at the very least just argue like for generally populist policies, or like a lot of disruption towards like the US and other like allies of the United States when there's a lot of like economic devastation within the country. So yeah, there are like a bunch of ideas I think one can expand or try and work on.
All right, that's a wrap for the USUDC training program. Thanks for watching.